Welcome to the Alden House Historic Sites presentation of Alden Archaeology, exhibiting the daily lives of a Mayflower family. My name is Desiree Mobed, and I'm the Executive Director. Together with the Alden Kindred of America, we preserve and share the legacy of Mayflower passengers John and Priscilla Alden and their homestead in Duxbury, Massachusetts. John and Priscilla were made famous when their descendant Henry Wadsworth Longfellow published his best-selling poem, The Courtship of Miles Standish. This romantic tale and Priscilla's immortal words, "Speak for thyself, John," made them part of the American culture. But with so few surviving historic records, the real story about this couple has been very hard to find. Archaeology has helped us uncover not only the home where they spent most of their married lives, but also to piece together more about their day-to-day activities from the bits of ceramics, glass, and metal that were discovered at their home site. As part of the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower, the Alden Kindred created a more extensive exhibit of these artifacts with the help of our guest curator, Stephen O'Neill. We're very excited to share this exhibit and the newly published exhibit catalog with you today. Stephen brought his deep understanding of 17th century Plymouth Colony to this project and a keen ability to bring even the smallest artifacts to life. Stephen is currently the Executive Director of the Hanover Historical Society, and in addition to being the guest curator for the Alden Kindred and their archaeology exhibit, he was the Massachusetts Foundation for the Humanities funded Scholar in Residence at the Old Colony History Museum in 2018, has taught as senior lecturer of history at Suffolk University in Boston, and was formerly the associate director and curator of collections at Pilgrim Hall Museum in Plymouth. He's also curated more than 20 exhibitions and guest curated exhibits at the Old State House in Boston and heritage museums and gardens on Cape Cod, and a very memorable pirate exhibit, which I personally and my family very much enjoyed. But without further ado, I want to turn this program over to Stephen. Stephen, thank you so much and welcome.
All right, let me share this. Thank you very much for the introduction, Desiree. This was quite an opportunity when I was approached by Desiree a few years ago to create this exhibit with the idea that we would be exploring new interpretations of the archaeological collection. It was a wonderful chance to tell a story and to revisit the 17th century and get to know, almost move in with John and Priscilla and their family. I always like to start off any talk about Plymouth Colony with a story. Many years ago, 25 plus years ago, I was doing a little research up on Burial Hill in Plymouth, and some tourists came up and, they were wandering around. It was a very hot July day, like the ones we've been having. And they saw me doing some work. And after a while, they came over and asked a question. And they said, "Excuse me, do you know where Miles Standish is buried?" So I kind of pointed across the bay to Duxbury and said, "Yeah, he's in the old burying ground over across the bay, over there in Duxbury." They looked a little disappointed and then asked, "Well, where is John Alden?" I pointed across the bay once again. This time they're starting to look very crestfallen. And then finally they asked, "Well, is Priscilla there too?" "Yes, across the bay." It was an interesting event because I've always remembered that, because when Americans have this idea of the Mayflower, of the Pilgrims, it's usually limited to the ship, to the rock, to Thanksgiving. It might have a few more details, It's something that almost every American knows, but doesn't know a lot of the details. Now, this exhibit was a real opportunity to explore life in Plymouth Colony. Plymouth didn't end with 1620 or 1621 at the first Thanksgiving. The people who arrived on the Mayflower, those who survived the first winter, many of them lived to old age, well through the history of Plymouth Colony into the later 17th century. So this exhibit was a wonderful chance to interpret their lives using the archaeological collection. And it is always being tweaked, it is always being added to, as you will see. Now, to begin with, the Mayflower, of course, arrives in Plymouth on the coast of Massachusetts, New England, 1620. They arrive late in the year. That first winter, half the number dies, as many people know. John Alden is hired as a cooper for the Mayflower voyage. That means he's in charge of taking care of all the barrels that hold the all-important beer on board the ship. John Alden was technically a member of the crew. He was an employee on the voyage, but he decided to stay in Plymouth and eventually became a farmer, was granted land, and became a magistrate, one of the leaders of the colony. He appears in numerous town records of Duxbury, in numerous references in the Plymouth Colony records. He's quite the fixture throughout much of Plymouth Colony's history. His wife is Priscilla Mullins. She arrives as a teenager and loses all three members of her family who traveled with her on the Mayflower, her parents and her brother. John Alden, Priscilla Mullins will end up marrying in 1623. The story made very famous by Longfellow in the 19th century, but it's their lives afterwards, their lives in Duxbury, that I've focused on in this exhibit and this catalog. They moved to Houndsditch, as it's referred to in some of the early records, on the Bluefish River in Duxbury around 1630. Sometime late 1620s, early 1630s, they're given this large portion of land in Duxbury alongside many neighbors like Philip Delano, George Soule, Miles Standish, William Brewster. You can see on this map here, the little blue rectangle is roughly the location of the first house site. And this map is the manuscript survey map done by Alden Benjamin, wonderful name, from 1795. You can see familiar geographical features like Powder Point right there, the Bluefish River, Duxbury Beach over on the far right. This house, this site, is the focus of the exhibit and the catalog. It was excavated in 1960. The Alden property had slowly sort of been whittled down a little bit. The current Alden house obviously has never been out of the Alden family ownership until the Alden kindred purchased it in the early 20th century. But the rest of the couple of hundred acres that John and Priscilla got originally had been sold off. And the custodian for the school, the local school, Russell Edwards, who was an Alden descendant himself, knew of the location of the first house site. It had been marked with a bronze marker back in the late 19th century. And the high school and the schools were about to make some ball fields. So he thought this was a good opportunity to do some excavation. And Roland W. Robbins was a self-trained archaeologist, and he was hired by Alden Kindred President Helen Bailey to conduct this excavation. He had a couple of assistants, and in July and October of 1960, began the excavations. And you can see in the pictures here, if you know the site now, you can't really drive out there, it's kind of frowned on, but you can see the wonderful old cars and the people observing the excavation in progress. And you can see the wonderful color picture of the foundations, the stone linings for a cellar and foundations that were uncovered. hundreds and hundreds of objects were uncovered as well. It is an extraordinary collection. Bits of glass, metal, nails, ceramic fragments, native pieces, pipes, tools, parts of weapons. Everything was cataloged by Robbins. Most of them date from about 1630 to about 1690. There are some, on either end. And he uncovered the outline of a long, narrow house, measuring roughly 10.5 feet by 38 feet. And a 4-foot deep stone-lined cellar at the western end. You can see that in the bottom of the picture on the right here. Robbins published an account of his excavation and his thoughts on it in 1969, called Pilgrim John Alden's Progress, with the Pilgrim Society and Pilgrim Hall Museum in Plymouth. Now, ever since then, there's been a lot of different interpretations on the site. It's a very narrow footprint, shall we say. And a lot of the reinterpretation over the past 40 years has said maybe there's a little bit more out there. Maybe there's a little bit more to the story. So what's hoped is that by analyzing the collections which are now housed up at the Fisk Center at UMass Boston, and by looking at other aspects of the collection, the site, and the history, we'll be able to get a clearer idea of John and Priscilla's daily lives, what their lives were like in this first house. Now, here's that interesting footprint of the site. Robbins did a good job, but archaeology is much more of a science. And the science of archaeology has grown exponentially in the years since 1960. Here you can see what he recorded, the root cellar, what's a possible pier up on the far left, the site of a chimney base, and those stones that he located in this rectangular formation. Many people have discussed the possibility that maybe there was a little bit more to the house, either to the north or the south, much more in keeping with the hall and parlor style of home with the central chimney, and then a kitchen added on in a lean-to in the back, similar to the initial constructions of other extant Plymouth Colony houses from the 17th century, like the Alden House, the Winslow House, the Sparrow House down in Plymouth. Now, looking at this, you get the sense of, one, really how small the house was. When you think of the family, famously, John Alden and Priscilla Mullins are the ancestors of some of the more numerous descendants. Alden descendants number in the millions. They had 10 children, 6 daughters, 4 sons, 8 of whom married and had children themselves. So when you think about it, there's anywhere from 6 to maybe as high as 12 people living in this small home at any one time during the 17th century. Now, what's also interesting is that any archaeological excavation around here will uncover evidence of native people. As my friend, the late Nana Pashamet, once said to me, "My people have been around here for 10,000 years. You're going to dig up all sorts of things about us." But it's also interesting in what was found. Wonderful examples of projectile points like the one seen here, grinders, mortar and pestles, sinkers, weights, fishing weights, mostly stone pieces, a few small ceramic pieces. But what's also interesting about the native pieces that are found in this excavation, they date anywhere from, say, about 1,000 years before present up to the contact period, up to the 17th century. The famous map of Plymouth Harbor called Port Saint-Louis by Samuel de Champlain that he published in 1613 shows native homes and fields and native boats all around Plymouth Bay. You got Manomet down on the far left, you got Plymouth Long Beach right there in the middle, the Eel River, you've got Duxbury Beach, the Gurnet and Saquesh, and houses around Duxbury. native presence didn't end once the Pilgrims arrived. There had been, of course, a horrific plague, a disease that swept down the coast from Maine towards Patuxent and towards the Cape, decimating as much as 90% of the coastal native population. Those people who survived fled inland, to escape this disease. Plymouth had been Patuxent, the native home of the Wampanoag people, but they were still around throughout much of Plymouth Colony history, even into the 18th century, still living traditional ways of lives, still hunting and farming, still moving down towards the ocean and the beach in the summer, into the more protected interior in the winter, which sounds fantastic. Who doesn't want to spend the summer by the beach? But their presence can be found in other ways. In many records, you see a lot of land transactions, you see a lot of deals, you see a lot of information. But in the archaeological record, you find the artifacts from them. This wonderful tiny little glass bead is a European bead. Glass beads were trade goods sent by the thousands to be traded with native people for supplies. To the native Wampanoag, Massachusetts, in this area, what was exotic to them were European goods that they didn't have. Cloth, metal goods, glass beads, items that were a little bit different, but that they incorporated into their own traditional culture. And then there is this ring. This is probably the most intriguing object uncovered in the entire excavation. It is a trade ring. It is brass with a little tin wash over it called latten, so tin brass. And this is a picture of the original. We have a reproduction made and on exhibit next to it. It shows St. Peter holding the keys of heaven. Now, this is an extraordinary survivor from this period, because Peter holding the keys of heaven comes from the Gospel of Matthew 16:19, where Jesus says to Peter, quote, "I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven." This is closely associated with the Roman Catholic Pope. So what is this doing here in a Pilgrim, Puritan, Protestant homestead? Well, Protestants viewed this passage of the Bible also for the doctrine of the power of the minister and the elders of the church, for the authority that the minister and elders had. But how did it end up here? That I would love to know. Rings like this could have possibly been brought by either John or Priscilla as a keepsake from England, but more likely it was distributed by the Jesuits up in New France. Trade rings like this with Catholic images, IHS or Paschal lambs, other figures like this, were distributed by the thousands to the converts up along the St. Lawrence River. But they were traded among native people, and similar trade rings were found in native sites throughout southern New England, most notably Burr's Hill, the Wampanoag burial ground, which dated from the 17th century. So this is really an extraordinary piece. How did it get here? How did it get to this site? Well, it could have been dropped by a native. It could have been given to John Alden by a native, perhaps when Alden was up in Maine along the Kennebec. I wish I knew. It is an intriguing item, and it hints at the possibilities of how you can tell part of this story, how you can connect to the Aldens and their daily lives with a much wider world that they lived in. Also found were some wonderful little coins. You can see the one on the left, the hard to read little guy, is a farthing. It's a copper farthing, dates from the reign of Charles II. You can see 1625, 1649. Can't see too many of the details on there, but a farthing in the 17th century had the value of 1/4 of an English penny. Not much. On the right is a far more interesting coin. This is an oak tree sixpence, minted here in New England, in Boston. The famous oak tree, willow tree, pine tree coins of New England all are dated 1652. That was the only year that New England was allowed to strike coins. But what New Englanders did up in Boston were they just kept that year on the coins as they just kept minting them for the next 2 decades. So this one probably dates from 1660 to 1667. Now, John Alden was a leader of Plymouth Colony and also a member of the militia. Every male who arrived in Plymouth Colony brought weapons with him, swords and muskets. This is an extraordinary piece that was uncovered in the excavation. It is the pieces of a snap-haunce musket lock. You can see the plate and some of the other smaller pieces. We've displayed it alongside a reproduction snap-haunce musket, so you can see exactly how it would work. Snap-haunce refers to the type of firing mechanism. It's a transitional form of musket between the older matchlocks of the late 1500s, early 1600s, and the later flintlocks, which were far more effective. All of them were heavy, however, and so heavy you needed a little pole to help you balance it. And found alongside the snap-haunce musket lock at the site was this wonderful little gun fork with the wonderful decorative scrolls on the top, that U shape. You see the reproduction there that we had made for the exhibit in a pole. This would be used to balance a musket when you were firing it. You can see the photo of a reenactor demonstrating exactly how that is working. So you can imagine how difficult and cumbersome these weapons were once they arrived here in New England. Also found on the site was this wonderful little iron pike head. Pikes were commonly used in 17th century in armies back in Europe. They would be attached to a pole, like so they're basically a long spear. The pole would be anywhere from 10 to as much as 20 feet long. They're designed to stop cavalry charges by the infantry. Well, once you get here to New England, there's not much use for these, so it becomes far more of a ceremonial weapon. And here you can see the original on the left and the reproduction we've had made for the exhibit itself. And one of the fun things that I wanted to do with this exhibit was select a group of objects and display them on a large size printout of this footprint, this excavated footprint of the home. It gives you a sense of where things were found. In the root cellar, so-called, a lot of stuff was found, because when the house was most likely taken down, everything was sort of pushed into this big hole in the ground. When the house, as we sort of think, was occupied from about 1630 to around 1690. The current Alden house most likely was built sometime 1680, give or take, and changed over the years. The Alden house at the first site most likely was taken down because there's no signs that was found of stress, no charcoal, nothing looked burned or melted. It didn't look like it fell down. It was most likely deliberately taken down. So everything was retrieved that was useful. But you can't leave a big hole in an open field. Your cattle will fall into it. So root cellars were often filled in when a house was no longer needed. So you get a lot of objects there. You've got objects up in the middle, at the very top, where there was possibly a door to the outside. And before the days of trash pickup on Thursday mornings, anything that got broken, you swept out the back door, and things got broken all the time. So most of the objects uncovered are bits, pieces, fragments of larger artifacts. And that's part of the fun. we've displayed some 30 some odd objects on this central case inside the exhibit. Now, we've chosen 10 to highlight in the catalog as a way of exploring the types of materials that we're talking about. So the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 correspond to the object and where it was found. So what objects were found that we talk about? Things like a button. You might think, okay, that's fine, but this is a very interesting little brass button. It is technically a stud, or the old-fashioned buttons that go through both sides of a shirt. It is brass, and it has mother-of-pearl inlay. Mother-of-pearl is the shiny interior lining of a lot of mollusk shells. Mother-of-pearl was used in a lot of different ways to decorate boxes or cabinetry or buttons or clothing. It's really shiny. So this is a flashy piece of clothing item. And you wouldn't think that, but here is a perfect example. And on the left, scissors. Most of us would take scissors for granted, right? Until we really need to cut something, we wouldn't really consider scissors unless we're buying them. But imagine coming to Plymouth Colony. You are the mother of 6 daughters. You need scissors. You need to mend clothing. Scissors like this one here, similar ones were found over at the Standish site, also in Duxbury, in the 1850s when that was excavated. Alongside the Standish ones were found a little whetstone for sharpening the scissors. These ones have iron handles with steel blades. Scissors are found in many objects, many probate records throughout Plymouth Colony. These would be used alongside, and they're fairly small, so they're hand scissors. They would have been used alongside other sewing-related items, thimbles, pins, needles, and thread. There we go. When I first put the little number 3, the pestle there on display, I didn't have a label with it. And I was having fun watching people try to figure out what it was. And most people thought it was a chess piece. They said, oh, I didn't know they played chess. But what this actually is a small bronze part of a pestle for use with a mortar. So this is probably the handle, and there would have been a larger section down below, maybe of a different material, used for grinding any variety of medicines or food pieces, grinding spices, food items, herbs, fruits, nuts, what have you. A large metal mortar with a provenance through the Winslow family is in the collection of Pilgrim Hall Museum. You find mortar and pestles, usually of metal, in many, many probate records. William Wright, his probate record from 1633 of Plymouth Colony, lists 1 small brass mortar and pestle, probably exactly like the one you see here. On the right is this neat little spout. It is a brass spout. It is most likely from a small kettle. John Alden, in his probate record, has listed as one of the pieces he owns, 1 quart kettle. So a neat little small kettle for boiling water, for use drinks, for food. Kettles are found in many, many probate records. And this neat little one is just tiny and very interesting when you think about the connections with food. What's going on around the hearth and where this was found. A wonderful little medicine glass bottle top, very delicate, very small. It is from a medicine file. It would have been used, a small little glass bottle were common for doctors, apothecaries. Household use would have been able to hold a variety of homemade medicines, such as rose water or oil of violets, which are called for in a lot of herbals or physician's assistant books for treating any number of maladies. The 1677 inventory of Nicholas Snow of Eastham lists one small glass bottle at 6 pence. So not expensive, but really a wonderful little example. On the right is the top of a spoon handle. Now this one is pretty interesting because most spoons at this time that you find in 17th century sites are sort of fig-shaped on the bottom. They have a thin handle, and then at the top, they usually have a circular little flat cap. They're called seal-top spoons. They're made of soft metals like pewter or brass with a tin wash, but this one looks like a strawberry. So it is called a strawberry knop spoon, and it's pretty early. It dates from 1600 to 1625. It is common for spoons to appear in many archaeological sites. Also uncovered alongside this were several bowls, several stems. When you think you're using a spoon almost every single day, that it gets a lot of use. They're imported from Europe, but the metal spoons will last a lot longer than wood or horn. But surviving examples have the interesting distinction that sometimes they're worn down on one side, in which you could probably tell whether the person was right or left-handed because of the softness of the metal. This wonderful little fragment of Rhenish stoneware, Vestavald, comes from Germany. It is that very distinctive gray earthen stoneware that has that wonderful cobalt blue glaze. When you see full pieces of Vestavald or Rhenish stoneware, they're really striking. The colors are just fantastic, a cobalt blue. Now, these are imported in many different types and varieties. Obviously, this little piece is just part of a rim. It could have been to a small mug, it could have been to a pitcher, it could have been to a bowl, it could have been to any number of varieties of vessels. Down below is a bronze weight. Now, weights like this are often found in a lot of the 17th century sites throughout North America. This is a time when you're doing a lot of weighing of money or metal or coins, gold, silver, what have you. This would have been used with a series of graduated smaller or larger weights with a steelyard, which is a simple little scale. Most money is valued by weight at this time because you never know who is counterfeiting. So weights like this, or square ones, appear in many probate inventories, appear in archaeological sites throughout the 17th century. Now, this wonderful little buckle down below, a small metal buckle. It's one of several buckles, buttons, and other pieces that were found at the site, excavated. This one, given the size of it, it's quite small, is most likely was used for a knee garter, a hat, or possibly for spurs, to hold spurs onto boots. That's the most likely one, and if it is, John Alden did own one horse at the time of his death, and other people in their inventories list a lot of the bits and bridles and spurs and all the other paraphernalia that goes with horse riding. And then finally, on the far eastern end of the site, were found these wonderful little Chinese porcelain fragments. These are extraordinary. And when you first see them and realize that, yeah, these came from China in the 17th century, it's really extraordinary. Fine white color, cobalt blue decoration, characteristic of Ming and Qing dynasty porcelain wares, exported from China around the world in the 17th century. This is most likely a small porcelain cup, probably not bigger than, the little teacups. It could have been acquired through trade. It could have been acquired and purchased from Thomas Willett, who was a known merchant, one of the wealthiest men in Plymouth Colony. And his inventory, Willett's inventory, lists a lot of, quote, outlandish things, meaning very unusual. Or it could have been perhaps a gift from their son, Captain John Alden, who was a sailor and a mariner, and who was in touch with much of the trade going on throughout the world, in the Atlantic and Pacific. It's extraordinary, and it would have been a real status piece sitting up on a press cupboard or off to the side. Now, those are just 10 of the objects, and those ones were chosen for their variety, their type. But we're still trying to think of what that house looked like. And to be quite honest, no one really knows what 17th century houses actually looked like. Those ones that are still standing have been altered, changed, renovated, expanded, and just really treated over the years. So trying to envision what the house is like was actually fun. We created this conceptual model, and it is based on the expanding the area of the footprint of the excavation about 2 feet in each direction, which gives you a larger and more common dimension of about 14 feet in width and about 40 feet in length. And this is, again, a conjectural model. And we built it so that the top can lift off and you can see the inside. And we added some gables and a lot of windows because lots of window glass were found at the site. A lot of architectural pieces were uncovered. More than 900 pounds of bricks were excavated, over 1,000 hand-wrought nails, more than 150 fragments of window glass. All of this suggests that this house was substantial. It was taken down and reworked over the years. So here are some of the pieces that we display. You can see on the left is a diamond casement window glass. Glass was, for windows, came in small wooden casements with, the diamond-shaped panes. And you can see the glass here. You can, in the top left and top right portions of the diamond, you can see that slight discoloration. That's from where this piece of glass was inside, held together by a lead cane. And there's a lead cane on the bottom. These are the little pieces that hold the glass in place. And to have all these really gives you the sense of, you think how dark these homes are. I'm sitting here in a renovated 300-plus-year-old first period house, the Stetson House in Hanover Center, and it's still dark, even on a bright sunny day, and it's still cold in the winter. Try to imagine what this home, the Alden house, was like. The small windows, the heat coming from one central source. On the far right is another architectural piece, a cock's head hinge, an iron hinge, which sort of has the shape of a rooster at the top and bottom. This is one half of a hinge. There would have been interior doors and doors leading to the outside. All these architectural pieces found alongside bits of plaster that was used for the walls gives you a sense of what probably was a substantial home in the 17th century, but according to our definitions, was probably very small and rather primitive. Now, recreating daily life. This was where we had some real fun with the exhibit. We wanted to take some of those fragments that we uncovered, that were uncovered in the excavation, and put them alongside modern reproductions as a way to really give people a sense of what an archaeological excavation and the pieces uncovered tell us. One of my favorites is the one on the bottom there with the glass. It's a wonderful dark green glass that has this slight curve on one side. And it is thought to be from a case bottle. Case bottles were square, about anywhere from 10 to maybe 15 inches high. They were designed to hold a variety of liquids and fit into slots in a wooden case, hence the name case bottles. Fragments of case bottles appear in many, many archaeological sites throughout New England, throughout North America. On the right is a truly fantastic example of a partially reconstructed storage jar, an Iberian storage jar. Now, these are wonderful because they appear in many sites. They are uncovered. This one, the fragments were reassembled as best as possible. And there you can see a reproduction right alongside of it. Now, these jars were used originally for olive oil. They come from Portugal and Spain, which were major trading partners with New England. What did New Englanders have that Spain and Portugal wanted? Salt cod. It was a staple food throughout Southern Europe, particularly Catholic Europe, where on Fridays you ate fish, and on saints' days or other holy days you ate fish. So salt cod was nutritious, kept well, and tasted good. It is still popular in Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese cuisine today. I highly recommend it, it's great. But in return for salt cod, New Englanders would bring back in jars like this olive oil, olives in brine. They would bring back citrus fruits, lemons and limes. Once the jar was empty after use, they could be reused for any number of liquids or other food items that needed to be stored. So fragments of these jars appear with great frequency throughout North America. The little faded green piece of ceramic, the photo on the left, on the left there, it's part of a charger, a large dish or bowl. And we found a reproduction with a similar pattern. You can see the sort of scalloped design there. Tin glazed earthenware, England, 17th century. Chargers like this, based on fragments from archaeological sites, based on existing examples in collections like the MFA in Boston, like Pilgrim Hall Museum. They're really brightly and gaudily colored. They're tin glazed, and oftentimes bright green, blue, red would be found. Blue is most common. And when you think about it, they're really these sort of busy patterns, but in a dark home with only candlelight, these are reflective of that little bit of light. So they act like mirrors. They shine in these dark homes. This would have been part of a real sort of status symbol piece that the Aldens would have shown off. On the flip side, you have a milk pan fragment. This is basic. This is earthenware from North Devon, England, 17th century. It is part of a milk pan. It is fairly solid, very, sort of sturdily made, kind of rough. Milk pans were common throughout North America. They were imported from England, from other parts of Europe. A whole parts of other milk pans were found clustered in the center of the Alden House site, so suggestive of where the work was being done. What's a milk pan for? Well, milk from cows would be strained first, poured into these wide, sort of shallow bowls. And 24 to 48 hours later, the cream would rise to the top. You'd skim that off, use it to make butter. The remaining milk, if not used probably immediately, particularly in the hot weather, could be made into cheese. Dairying was most likely done by Priscilla and the girls, although the boys would have helped as well with the care of the animals. When you think about it, we've got to remember this is long before the days of refrigeration, long before the days of pasteurized, homogenized milk. Milk is drunk quickly, otherwise it spoils because it is so high in fat content. It gives you a sense of the activities, the farm life that dominated the Alden family during a day-to-day basis. Last couple of pieces. Pipe bowls and stem fragments. The Aldens, like everybody else, smoked. Everybody smoked tobacco. Virginia tobacco, which derived originally from the Caribbean, which tobacco in its various varieties is native to the Americas. Pipe smoking and tobacco became common throughout the 17th century. Virginia's early economy was built on smoke. Tobacco around here that was grown by natives originally who smoked was not as sweet as Virginia tobacco, the Caribbean derived tobacco. It was a little bit more harsh. So imports of Virginia tobacco and imports of pipe were so common that fragments of pipes are found everywhere at archaeological sites. They're found with such frequency and regularity. And it is known that the development of pipes changed over time. Bowls got steadily larger, and the bore through the stem, the little hole, got steadily bigger over time. Right? So you can date a site based on the bowl, the stem width, the bore size, and these fragments here show you some examples of these mid-17th century pipes. The little red one down the bottom most likely came from Virginia, where red clay was sometimes used in place of this white clay, kaolin clay that came from Europe. So I hope nobody's shocked to learn that their Alden ancestors were smoking tobacco all the time. And last, the little candle holder. The fragment is the little brown piece on the left-hand side. Candles were expensive. Wax was expensive. Beeswax was the most common. More often, people lit their homes with tallow, with lamps, with wicks dipped in animal fat, which probably really didn't smell too good. But candle holders like this were found, so we do know they had wax candles at least various times. And just think of lighting. We take for granted walking into a room and flipping a switch, and we have unlimited light and electricity. Think of how crazy we start going when there's a blackout. Wait, where have all the flashlights, the candles? Think of how dark it was in these homes in the 17th century. Light cost money at the time, just like it does now, but it was far more something you had to create yourself, whether it was from wax or from tallow. Now, all of these pieces lead together into a story. They tell the story of this family, John, Priscilla, and their 10 children. The images you see here are original copies of John Alden's probate record, which listed out his remaining possessions when he passed away in the 1680s. It lists things like, cattle, sheep, swine, a horse, a quart kettle, brassware, cooper's tools and carpenter's joiners, 2 old guns, old iron, table linen and other linen bedding, horse bridle and saddle, and unfortunately they lumped together in one line, library and cash and wearing clothes. I wish they'd taken a few minutes and listed out the books that John Alden owned and was reading. And you can see on the right picture down the bottom, it lists the names of the children who were alive at the time, or the spouses if the daughter had passed away. All of this is an attempt to tell a story. Using the archaeology, what I tried to do with this whole exhibit, catalog, and talk project was to really sort of suggest how we can interpret the lives of these 17th century Plymouth colonists, these extraordinary people who traveled across the ocean, who arrived here in Plymouth, who settled in Duxbury, and who lived throughout the 17th century. As I finish the catalog, I write, the Alden First House site may still hold secrets underground. There is more to the story of the family in the Alden First House's archaeological collection. This collection reveals the influence and presence of a wider world, connecting the Aldens' small little corner of New England to Europe, to Africa, to the rest of the Americas. It reveals the world in which the Aldens lived their daily lives, connected by a wide highway of the Atlantic Ocean. That same ocean that brought John and Priscilla together when they crossed aboard the Mayflower in 1620. Thank you very much. I will happily take questions if we have time for that.
Oh, Stephen, thank you so much. I have to share with you all that every time I've seen visitors go into that exhibit when Stephen is there, they're just mesmerized and you know how he weaves together these stories and the objects. And I hope that you all have a chance to actually come by Alden House and see it in person. But let's get to the questions because we do have some, Stephen, and I know I was waiting for you know, the end to go ahead and share them with you. And from Alan, who's actually sent a few questions. So we will share several of them. Were any of these objects radiocarbon dated to verify their age? And that would be a good tie-in to how we know the dates of some of these pieces.
They haven't actually been radiocarbon, but one of the various collections, all the glass, the window glass, there's a short article in the catalog written by one of the graduate students from the Fisk Center, she has since graduated, who uses some scientific approaches looking at the chemical composition of the glass itself and is able to tell and date the glass. Most of it is from the middle to late 17th century. As for radiocarbon, that has not been done yet. That needs to be done on organic materials. Most of the pieces are metal, they're glass, they're ceramics. So we'll see. It's a great suggestion. And as more and more graduate students start working on investigating I think there's some 15, 16 boxes of materials up at the Fisk Center, hopefully something will turn up with that.
Oh, absolutely. So now another question, and this is a very good one, not just in the 17th century, but into the 18th century, did they use housing plans? So how did they come up with that rather interesting rectangular shaped house? Or was it all done by eye? And this also is one of Alan's questions.
Yeah, from what I understand, it's vernacular architecture, 17th, 18th century. Very few plans were ever drawn up. You know, you think of, you know, very famously, Thomas Jefferson's wonderful plans and elevations for Monticello, which he changed several times over the years. Mostly it is a craft tradition. House rights are frequently listed as an occupation in Plymouth Colony in the 17th and then Mass Bay in the 18th century. House rights learned as apprentices, just like any other craft trade. The hall and parlor style of home is most common. It takes advantage of, like at the Alden House, a central chimney, which you can build one room on one side, and then in a few years you can add on another room on the other side, put chambers above it, and then a lean-to in the back for a kitchen. Hall is where a lot of the work is done for the family, so cooking, cleaning, you know, any sort of chores. Parlor is a little bit nicer, so it would have had a bed. Hall and parlor houses, particularly in Mass Bay, there's some wonderful examples from the period. You know, you can look at the Winslow House in Marshfield. You can look at the Scotch Boardman House up in Saugus. Even the Paul Revere House, which isn't a hall and parlor, it just has the hall on one side of the chimney stack.
So, and actually, I think one of the essays by one of the graduate students who studied the ceramics actually looked into see if they could really determine specific activity areas, even in that, within that very small foundation. And she was able to determine, definitely the cooking area, based on the ceramics that were found, and then off to the eastern side of it, fewer, so possibly a chamber or a storage area. It's fascinating. And as we're able to study more, it'll hopefully reveal more of those secrets. All right, so this is from Beth, Stephen. Were there any native pottery or basket items found? So you might want to, can you talk about that one very fascinating pottery piece that we know about?
Yeah, no basket fragments were found, but a few native ceramic pieces were found, including a small little fragment with that wonderful sort of inlaid pattern that a lot of native pottery had. It was most likely part of some form of vessel. Hopefully, we can take a good look at it. What the next step for the collection is to really have a student look at and evaluate the handful of native ceramic pieces that were uncovered, in addition to the stone liths, which are much older. It'd be great to find ceramic pieces from the contact period, from the 17th century, which would suggest a lot of close interaction between the Aldens and the native people of Plymouth Colony.
Yes, and I just want to point out again that it's the University of Massachusetts Boston's Fisk Center that has recently provided some wonderful scholarship from 3 graduate students who two of them worked on the ceramic collection and one on the glass, and really helped, I think, advance, what we know about this site. So we're very, very appreciative to them. Judith asks about the probate record, Stephen. Does that mean the handwriting could, not have been John's, right? And do we know any documents with John's handwriting on them? And I know you know this one, Stephen. Very well.
Yes, there are documents with John Alden's signature on them. Pilgrim Hall has 2 examples of his signature. Both are on deeds. Those are the 2 that I'm most familiar with. John Alden being one of the leaders of the colony, also very involved with a lot of land transactions, court records. Chances are his signature appears many times. I know Pilgrim Hall has them. I used to bring them out every Thanksgiving when we showed documents with signatures of people who were at the first Thanksgiving, which was a lot of fun.
Can you talk a little bit about how probate records were put together? I think, that would be helpful as well. And typically by whom?
Probate records were basically an inventory of the objects that somebody owned when they died, when they passed away. And it gives a sometimes wonderful example of everything they owned with a value to it. This is at a time when not many people had hard cash, or there were no banks. So ownership, property was the movables, the stuff like tables, chairs, clothing, books, weapons, food, as well as animals, as opposed to the property itself, like real estate, land. Probate records were often done by a neighbor. John Alden participated in creating the probate records for Miles Standish, for instance. It was John Alden's son, Jonathan, who inherited the house, the property, that did the probate for his father. And some are fairly quick, others are very detailed. Sometimes they actually list the various rooms where you can see what was going on where in the house. They're fascinating documents, and they help support a lot of the archaeology, a lot of the material culture study, as well as gives you a sense of what a family owned and what was important to own at the time.
And now a question from Sydney, Stephen, is why did the Aldens settle in Duxbury instead of Plymouth? Sydney, that's a good question. And so many visitors, as Stephen knows, when they come here to Alden House in Duxbury, that's one of their first questions. Why Duxbury?
Plymouth at the time, like now, was a small little settlement, based around Leiden Street, basically downtown Plymouth. It was a fortified little town. And originally in the beginning, many of the settlements in colonial New England, the European settlements, were fashioned after European style towns, where you have a small central area where everybody lives, and then the fields all around. That didn't work here because Plymouth has a very narrow little section that is good for farming. Plymouth has a lot of sand and pine barrens. If you ever go out to, Miles Standish State Forest or down to the Pine Hills, it's not good land for farming. What people wanted, particularly in the 1630s, was property, farmland, marshland, places where they could raise cattle, raise horses, pigs. They wanted to farm. So many of the leading people in Plymouth Colony got land in Duxbury, around Standish Shores, up towards Powder Point, and even further if you get into Marshfield, where the Winslows and people like Peregrine White inherit land up there. Farmland, access to marsh grass, access to waterways, these were what people wanted. And as Bradford very famously pointed out, everyone, he was very sad that everybody spread out. He wanted this compact little community, but that's not what happened here in New England. It was far more important to live on your own property. And that's why in a lot of these towns, you don't get the real little town center until later in the 19th century. Everybody's just sort of in their own little neighborhoods. The Alden grant, which includes much of the high school, the library, the ball fields now down towards Route 3, was really, if you look at it, it was great for farming. Good flat land, access to a river means access to fish. Fish hooks were found in the archaeological site. Ox shoes for oxen, for plowing. So the Aldens really got a great spot when you think about it.
Yeah. The another question, and one that often comes up. So how, looking at what was found in the inventory, in the archaeology, and even the probate inventory, how do you think that the Aldens sort of related economically to the other families in Plymouth Colony? Sort of economic status. How would you assess that?
That's actually a fairly interesting question because you can look at it in many different ways. Alden being one of the first comers, when he, in 1682, he testifies that he is, quote, aged 83 years or thereabouts, and he was one of the first comers into New England to settle at or about Plymouth. So he had this status of being a leader. He had political offices. He was freeman of the town. But also, he was a farmer. But being a political figure, he had to be away from home a lot. He traveled up to Maine, had a few issues up there. He's traveling around the colony a lot, settling disputes, overseeing colony affairs. And he's got 10 children. 10 children are never cheap. When you think about, providing food for the children, for running this farm, Priscilla probably had her hands full, 10 children in 20 years. There's at one point in one of the records, Alden actually has to petition the court, the general court, for extra funds to help in his support. So he is certainly of high status, but of material wealth, probably not what we would consider the richest in the colony. When you look at some of the other people, what they owned, their estates are much larger in their probate records. Alden, however, in his record, it's not as big as others, but that's also because he had already deeded over the property to his son, Jonathan, who would inherit it. So I have this vision of a very old John Alden sort of sitting in his home, the home that he had lived in all his life, while Jonathan is building the newer home, the one you can see behind Desiree. And, you know, he's just happy with what he has around him. Alden is also a tradesman. He is a woodwright. He has cooper's tools. He's making barrels. He's making furniture. Chances are several of the wonderful furniture pieces, press cupboards or chairs in some of the collections around, he had a hand in making. So I would say he's of the middling level, you know, a very dedicated public servant, but it also probably cost him a lot.
Yeah. Thank you, Stephen. So we have two more questions, and then I know if people are on their lunch hour, we are recording again this program, so you'll be able to watch it later and share it certainly with others. A question from about whether the Aldens had any slaves or maybe even any indentured servants.
I really don't know the answer to that one. Most families in Plymouth Colony would have servants of one variety or another. Usually what happened was older children, say 12 to 14, 15, would be put with another family where they would help with raising younger children. They would often be trained in a craft, like a housewright, a shipwright, a cooper, something like that, or a mason. I don't know. I haven't really looked at the Aldens. Somebody probably knows. I do know that actual slaves were fairly rare in Plymouth Colony. The one exception is Thomas Willett, who knew John Alden as a fellow magistrate leader of the colony. Willett, however, was a merchant he came over around 1630 when he was about 19, coming from Leiden. So he knew Dutch. He spoke English and Dutch, and he traded heavily with the Dutch settlers in New Amsterdam and New Netherlands. Very, very wealthy because of this trade, and he owned at least 8 black slaves in his probate record from the 1670s. That's the exception to the rule, though. Most people had servants, and usually they were from other families. Indentured servants were common, you know, coming over from England, sent over. In the biography of Peregrine White I wrote last year, Peregrine White himself had an indentured servant who then later moved down the Cape after working with Peregrine White for a few years, living there, and became a leather harnesser, a saddler, making leather goods. So I'm sure somebody knows all about the Aldens and whether they had servants or not. I just don't know right now.
Yeah, there's been nothing in the records, you know, obviously it's not on the probate, and nothing that I know of that's been found about that, but it's an interesting question, certainly. So just one more question, and then we want to make sure that we mention a couple of these books that this program was based on. And so the last one is The Future. And Stephen, we've talked about this actually fairly recently. The future, some future possibilities for this site. I know, just very briefly for our Alden members and supporters out there, we are working with the town of Duxbury to gain an easement for that first site, because that area is no longer in Alden hands as ownership, as Stephen had pointed out. And we actually have a surveyor coming just to establish the boundaries in a couple of weeks, and we will be going forward with that project with the town, and that will help give us a little bit more stewardship of the site. It's sort of tucked behind the schools right now and much enjoyed, but you know, it's always good to have watchful eyes keeping track of all these important historic treasures. So Stephen, do you want to talk about that from an archaeology standpoint?
Sure. There's actually several ways for the future, several hopeful pathways for the future. One is perhaps some more investigation on the site itself, whether archaeological or ground penetrating radar or some other method. Another is maybe a little bit more interpretation and preservation of the site. There is some signs out there now, and it's marked off fairly clearly, but perhaps something more can be done. People have gotten creative with a lot of archaeological sites over the years. And then there's the collection itself, what was uncovered. It is really great to see the renewed interest in the Alden archaeological collection. The stewardship up at the Fisk Center has been great, not only for the preservation of the collection, but also for having students interact with it, research it, work with specific aspects of the collection. There's always more interpretations, always more methodologies that could be applied to the pieces, the native pieces, the ceramics, the metals, the architectural elements that were uncovered. Those are the areas that I see as the future. Also, the exhibit is fluid over the past couple of years since we installed it. We've been tweaking it, and we hope to keep doing that over the years as we add more elements to it. Right now, we have just received a reproduction buff coat, which will be able to be tried on should you visit. You will be able to try on a buff coat is an oxhide coat that went under a piece of armor for militiamen in the mid-17th century. And then you can hoist that reproduction Snap-Ons musket, position it on the reproduction gun fork, and see how heavy all of those things really are once you put them together. It really, hopefully, will be a little bit more experiential and evocative of what daily life was like. There's always more ways to explore the lives of, say, Priscilla, and you think of the two of the daughters who never married. What was their story? What did they do? And how, from the archaeology, could we recreate what maybe some of their life was like? So there's if you ask these questions, this is where I see those pathways leading.
Thank you, Stephen. So now, before we close this out, certainly we want to encourage you to visit Alden House Historic Site. We're open for guided tours through mid-October. The hours and days are posted on our website, and part of the archaeology exhibit, of course, is part of your guided tour. We also have, as Stephen has mentioned, some wonderful new books that we're sharing. And Stephen, are you going to do the present, the official showing? Which one are you going to show first? I'm going to show the catalog first. That's right. I have to show the catalog, and I'm not sure. Can you see that okay? Is it showing?
Not really.
Not really. Well, it was the cover of our opening slide. Alden Archaeology Exhibiting the Daily Lives has just been published, and you can get your copy today or anytime. It's offered in the Alden shop. And now, Stephen, it's your turn. You'll do better on showing the pieces.
There's two other books that complement this exhibit catalog. One is the Duxbury 2020 Our Pilgrim Story, which is a series of really wonderful essays. I have one in there on day-to-day life, looking at how we can recreate daily life in 17th century Duxbury. But it talks about the Aldens, it talks about some of the early settlers and roads. Really a fascinating, well-illustrated, and really well-written collection of essays. And then just to promote myself, last year, the Marshfield Historical Society published The Life of Peregrine White, the first Englishman born in New England, which is, I'm the author of, and it is a complete biography of Peregrine White, the little boy born aboard the Mayflower while it was anchored in Provincetown Harbor in 1620, and who lived till 1704. So it was a great challenge, and it was a fun, another fun opportunity to really explore life in 17th century Plymouth Colony.
And the Winslows were right up the road from the Aldens, were neighbors and so forth. So it's a wonderful book, all of them. I highly recommend it. Please check back for programs again as we continue to go through this year. We look forward to seeing you again. We thank you so much for your time today. Stephen, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. And please stay in touch, everyone, at alden.org. Thank you so much.
Thank you.